Hey everybody, in this video we're going to be showing you a great method of painting the legendary Commander Farsight for Warhammer 40,000 by Games Workshop. Now not only is this probably the coolest Tau character in my personal opinion, but also he's one of the coolest models as well. And in this video we're going to be showing you how to paint him from start to finish. But also we're going to give you some key information on building the miniature and also sub-assemblies, which we definitely recommend you follow. It's going to make painting him much easier. And in addition, it's worth noting that all the methods and techniques we're going to show you here are ideal for painting any kind of battle suit or even Fire Warrior. So if you want to collect an army of the Farsight Enclaves, then this is the video for you. Hope you enjoy it. Let's get started. Before we start painting Commander Farsight, there are some important things that we need to take a look at, because as I mentioned in the intro, there are various little assemblies and little quirks that you need to be aware of when you're starting out with this miniature. Now, the first thing to do is to make sure that you choose the right sort of undercoat colour. And if you're painting the Farsight Enclaves, going for a red undercoat is really useful because it makes the initial stages a breeze. So for that reason, I've chosen some Mephiston red spray from Citadel, but really any sort of bright red like this will be absolutely fine. The exact colour doesn't matter a great deal because we are going to be starting out by establishing a particular colour anyway, so don't worry about it. But if the miniature is undercoated red, then this first stage is going to be really quick and easy to do. Now also I've got various sub-assemblies. You can see I've got the jump jets and also I've got the arms. I've kept them separate from the main assembly. Now this is important allowing access to detail, and we'll take a look at the jump jets first of all, because with these what we need to do is just make sure that we can easily access various details on the back, because they kind of pin in onto areas like that and they start to obscure quite a bit of the detail there. So for the base coating stages it's just a good idea to keep them separate so we can access those parts really easily. More important than that, however, is the arms, because if you look at the arms, we've actually got some detail inside here and these rings, and when you're building the miniature you'll find the arms don't actually fit onto the body of the battle suit itself. Instead they fit onto these rings. They kind of go on there like that, meaning that you've got a gap right in there between the arm and the battle suit, and there's detail on the inside of these parts with like hexagonal pattern just there. There's some emitters on the inside just there. I assume it's for some sort of like energy talking to the various components of the suit there to make it work. Now this is all well and good, but bear in mind that if you stick the miniature together, getting into that area is very difficult because there's detail in there. If you undercoat the model red, that's going to show up as unpainted and it's going to ruin the overall effect. So by keeping the arms separate, we can actually access that part with a brush and paint it at least black. This way it'll look complete when the model goes together. Now the gap is so narrow that it's actually hard to get a paintbrush in there, and that's why it's so important to keep the arms separate, at least for part of the painting process. Now one other thing about these sub-assemblies is you'll notice this time I've not mounted them on any little brass wire bits like that and bases just to hold them whilst painting them. That's because of the way that these go together with those rings. If you take a look, there is no place where we can drill a hole and then, well, hide that hole on the inside just there, because you are going to see it. So that's why I've not mounted them on anything. It's okay though, because we're not going to keep them separate for all that long. Once we've got some initial base coats on there, we are going to glue it together and go from there. So don't need to worry about it. It's not going to be for that long. Now with all that out of the way, there's one other thing that we just need to address, and that was during the building of the miniature, because I found when building the torso of Farsight that the fit of the upper torso to the lower torso just here was quite difficult to get together, because there's a locating pin to get this particular pose, and getting it to actually go into the slot where it's supposed to be is really difficult. It feels like some resistance there. So I found it was actually better to assemble this upper torso around the hips just there. So I recommend you do the same. When you get to that part, just glue on one side of the body onto the joint in there, and the other side on the other side, and then just do the rest of the assembly from there. If you do that, you can ensure you're going to get the right pose. So with all that out of the way, we can now actually start painting the miniature, and what we need to do is go first of all for that red I mentioned. So you just need to choose your mid-tone red that you want your battle suit to be. We want a nice vibrant bright red, so in this case I picked out Sanguine Scarlet, and to apply it just get hold of an old rough base coating brush. So I have here a old medium base coat brush from Citadel, and with this, as usual, what we need to do is just thin the paint down with a touch of water, being careful not to overdo it, and then start applying it onto the armor panels that we want to be red. Now in these early stages, don't worry about the other colours because we're going to apply them later anyway, but what we do need to do is just ensure that anything that is going to be bright red is painted with this colour. So for example, this plating just here, I'm just going to quickly put it over there like that, and here you can really see the advantage of that red undercoat in that doing this is really quick and really easy. So all you got to do is just go around the assemblies looking for red armour and just painting it with this colour at this stage. And here we have the model with that red established on it, and you can see I've got it on the arm too, and I've done the exact same thing on all the other various smaller assemblies. Now you might be wondering then, why would you want to paint it red if it's already undercoated red? And that's for two reasons. Firstly, to make sure that you've got all the angles, so no plastic showing through, but also it means now that we've actually got an established mid-tone that is the paint on version that you have available, meaning that should you make any mistakes later on, you can go back to this paint and neaten it up, and then you won't see the difference. Now if you had skipped doing that initial stage of painting everything red, then you would see the difference, and that's why it's so important. Now with that done, what we're now going to do is start applying our second base coat colour to the miniature, which needs to be a pitch black for the inner parts of the suit. In this case, I'm going to use some Doom Death Black, and to apply it, what you'll want to do is change brushes depending on what region you're doing, but for most of it, I'm going to be using a newer medium base coat brush from Citadel that's still holding a fairly good point, so it gives a bit of accuracy here because there is quite a lot of ground to cover. Now as usual, make sure you thin your paint down on the palette so it's under control and nice and smooth, and then it's time to start looking for the black details. And whilst you're doing this, I definitely recommend you use the box art as some reference here, but generally speaking, you're looking for the more internal parts of the machine skeleton and avoiding the armour. So for example, on the leg just here, we're looking at this sort of region around here. Now whilst you're doing this, inevitably you will start splashing little bits onto some of the red armour. It's always going to happen because of the complexity of the shapes of it, but don't worry about it. Just let this black paint dry, then go back to your original red and just tidy up before you move on to the next stage. And here we have two of the assemblies with that black blocked in. Now doing that does take a little bit of time, but it's important to make sure everything is nice and tidy before you move on to the next stage, which is going to be to do some shading. But before we actually do that, we're now at a point where we can glue the arms on. Now not yet going to glue on the jump jets because I still want easy access to the back of the miniature, but the arms certainly can go on now because we painted the inside of those shoulders with black. So now's the time to do that with a little bit of super glue, which is what I'm going to do now, and when we come back, we'll start doing that shading. And here we have the model with those arms glued on, so now we can move on to the next colour, which is going to be a case of adding in the second tone of red that appears in the miniature. And this is a dark one, more of a sort of winey kind of red. So I've picked out some Vorbak Red for this, and to apply it, I'm going to go for my size 0 brush once again. And for this stage, all you need to do is start working your way around the miniature, just picking out the panels that are in this colour. And once again, just use some box art to guide you through this part, because they're kind of scattered all around. Tends to be smaller details. But for all of this, just make sure the paint's thinned down, and once you're ready, it's time to start applying it. Now bear in mind this red is quite a weak paint, so you will have to do this as a few thin coats, but just bear that in mind. You want the final result to be as smooth as possible before you move on to the next stage. Once you're happy with that second shade of red, the next thing to do is to do some shading on both shades of red here. And for this, what we need is a black wash. And the idea is to paint it neatly into the recesses because there's quite a lot of flat panels here. So if you were to just wash it all over the miniature, there's quite a lot of neatening up to do. Whereas if we paint it into the recesses, then that neatening up is much reduced. So it makes this stage faster. So what you need is a black wash, and I'm using some Oblivion black wash here. And to apply it, you should go for a fine brush. So in this case, I've gone right down to a size 00 from Artis Opus. But any small brush like this will be fine. One that holds a good point is just what you need, really. What you got to do is load up some of this, just being careful not to overdo it so you don't lose that point in your brush, and then start looking for all the recesses on both shades of red. So for example, if we look at the panel around the front just here, just want to look for those corners and start running this wash directly into that deepest area to get the shading in those parts. Now it is inevitable that you will end up splashing some of this wash onto some of the flat panels as I mentioned, but don't worry about it, just let it dry, then go back to the relevant red and neaten up before you continue. And here we have the model with that shading applied, and I have just taken a few minutes to make sure everything's neat and tidy on those shades of red and the black, and so with that done we can now add in another colour onto the miniature because we now got a great opportunity to add in the white details. Now the white on Commander Farsight these days is kind of like an ivory white, so it's like off-white here, and so what we're going to do is start out with that by picking out an ivory colour for the base coat. So what I've got is some Ivory Tusk here. Now because we're going over a red going to a near white, this does mean we've got quite a jump to make here, so just bear in mind this is going to require a few coats. Just make sure you be patient here and take your time gradually building up that colour to get that smooth finish before you move on after this. So with that in mind, what we should do is make sure the paint's nicely thinned down on the palette, and I'm using my size 0 brush here for this base coat. Change as you need to depending on the size detail though, but this is a good all-rounder for most features. So we just need to make sure the paint's nice and thin and nice and smooth. So there we go. And then we can start applying it. And we'll take a look at the helmet first of all, where the top of it is this colour. So what we want to do is block this in. And you'll see what I mean with that red showing through. But as I mentioned, it's not an issue. Just let this coat dry completely, then apply a second, followed by a third over the top to build it up to that smooth finish before you move on to the next stage. I finished base coating those off-white details there with a few thin coats, so now what we can do is some shading and then clean those parts up. Now you'll notice I've not put any of those white set markings on there just yet, because that's something I tend to like to come back to later on when we're doing final details. That's why I've not done any of that at this stage. But for the panels, we definitely need some shading there. And so what we're going to go for is kind of a deeper ivory colour for the shading and mix it with a medium to turn it into a wash. So what I've got is some Griffon Claw. I'm going to mix it with some Lahmian medium to give it the properties of a wash. And then once that's done, what we'll need to do is clean up the colour to bring it closer back to being towards a white. So in this case, I'm going to go back to some Ivory Tusk. But first we've got to make that mix. So it's going to be Griffon Claw and some Lahmian medium. And to get this ready, I'm using my size 0 brush once again, because you've got some Griffon Claw just there on the palette. And what I'm going to do is build up a good puddle of the medium right next to it, just here. So 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. So there we go, plenty of that medium. Then all we need is a small amount of this paint to mix in there to get a wash-like paint just like that with that kind of colour on there. So with that all mixed up and prepared, what we can do is make sure we don't got too much on the brush at once so we don't overwhelm things. And then with this, what we need to do is paint it directly over the top of these off-white details. So on the helmet, for example, just want to paint it along like this so it runs into those recesses and gives us some shading. Now, it will stain some of the flatter areas a little bit, so we just need to keep it as thin as possible in those parts so as not to overwhelm them. But really what we're looking for is that darker colour in the recesses. Once that mix is completely dry, we can then re-establish the mid-tone here by returning to that original colour that we used. So in this case, that's going to be Ivory Tusk, but this time the application is a bit more precise because we need to focus on these flat areas, such as this part just around the head right here, being careful not to drop into those recessed areas. And there we are, that off-white's now been cleaned up. And at this stage, you can see the model's really looking the part of Commander Farsight. So what we can do is move into highlighting these colours that we've got on here. And what we should do is start out with the big one. So this is the highlight that's going to take the longest and easily be the longest stage out of painting the entire miniature. But once this is done, you're on the downhill slope from here on in. So what I'm looking at here is that lighter red armour. What we need to do is edge highlight it with a lighter red. So I picked out some Demon Red for this. And to apply it, you definitely want to go for your finest brush. So go for the smallest one you've got. I've got my size 00 from Artisopus here. And the key thing is that it's got a nice fine point on it to help us do accurate lines as we paint this onto the miniature. Now the real trick to doing this is to make sure you thin your paint down correctly. And you can see what I'm doing is gradually adding a bit more water into the paint, just bringing in some of that pigment as we go along. And I'm looking for the sweet spot where it flows really well from the brush, but not so thin that it goes out of control. And you can always test on the palette by having a go at painting lines. And there we go, you see that goes really nicely. So that's the sort of consistency that we're looking for. So with that achieved, just make sure your brush isn't overloaded by removing excess paint, and then we can start looking for the edges. And when it comes to Tau, first of all, look for these sharper angles that really stand out, such as the rim of the shield, because ones like this you can pick out with the side of the brush really quickly and easily if you just go at it at a sharp angle there like that. Same is true on things such as the collar, which is a little bit more tricky to get to because of the various details around it. But you see, if you approach, so you're just going to be touching that edge with the side of your brush, you can skim along, and this way you get a sharp highlight really quickly and really easily. Now for a lot of these angles, you're just not going to be able to do that because it's difficult to get the brush into them. So in these cases, we all need to do a switch to using the tip of the brush instead. Now I like to just angle the model so I'm painting downwards like this and looking down the length of the brush, because this gives some accuracy as you go down that edge. And what you're aiming to do is to use the tip of the brush to paint as sharp a line as possible, following that corner all the way down. So you can see just like there on the gorget on either side there, because it's got those two lines to do. Then we can switch back to the side of the brush going around this part just here. So you can see with this example here why this stage takes so long, because there are a lot of edges to do. But as I mentioned, once this is done, everything gets quicker from here on in. So what I recommend you do is just get comfortable, make yourself a hot drink, pop on your favourite audiobook and just settle in, and it'll be done before you know it. And here we have Commander Farsight with that initial red highlight applied to all those bright red panels. And you'll notice too at this stage, I've glued on the jump jets, because with that first highlight applied, we've now actually got to all those really awkward parts that need that first highlight on the inside there, meaning we can now stick them on and make things much easier to handle. So I just did that with a little bit of super glue. And whilst I mentioned that stage did take quite a bit of time, with it done now, things are going to get much quicker, because with that red, we can push it just a bit further with a fine highlight using an orange just to help it pop a little bit more. But this time we don't have to do everything, just like prominent edges that really stand out. So what you need is a bright orange, and here I'm going to use some orange flare, and to apply it, go for your same brush, because we're going for the same sort of technique, just as I mentioned, a little bit more selectively applied. So just make sure your paint's nicely thinned down and translucent too. So there we go, that sort of consistency is what we're after. Make sure there's a small amount in your brush, and then just do a quick once around on the miniature, looking for more prominent edges and angles that stand out more. For example, on this part here, just in front of the head, we can just do a little flick across these corners and edges, just there and just there. The result is that it just brightens up the red and just helps these edges just stand out from a distance that little bit more too. So now it's just a matter looking for all sharp corners like this one just here in the shoulder and just flicking along each one around the miniature. And with that, the lighter red is now fully highlighted, so we can move on to highlighting the other shade of red. So we're looking at that darker, more wine red colour here, and in this case going to go for the same technique but with some different colours for the highlights, starting out with some Wazdaka red, then moving on to a fine highlight of Squig orange. Now we'll start out with Wazdaka red, and to apply it I'm going to go for that small brush again, because really we're looking at the exact same technique here of edge highlighting, looking for all the corners and angles and following along each one. Now because there's not actually that much of this darker red, this stage will be quite quick, so nice and easy to do. But for the process, again, just make sure you paint thin down and ready, and then start looking for the edges on all these parts. So for example, on his shield just here, because you've got this little red segment that's in the darker red, and we're looking for that outer edge where we can use the side of the brush, but when we can't quite get the side of the brush there, it's time to switch to use the tip of it and just follow that edge all the way around. And once you've finished that edge highlight, we can then move on to adding a fine edge highlight, just like we did on the lighter red a moment ago with that orange. And here I'm using some Squig orange and looking to apply it in the same sort of way. So looking for areas where the light would catch or that stand out more prominently, and just introducing a little bit of this colour on those corners. And with that, the secondary red is now fully highlighted too, so it's time to move on to highlighting the black, followed by the white. Now we'll start out with that black, and here we should begin with a dark grey, so I'm going to use some Dungeon Stone Grey here. Then once that's done, like with the reds, we'll do a fine highlight. So here we want a light grey, going to use some Calcaridon Grey in this case. Finally, we need to highlight the near white details, and in this case all we need is a pure white, so I'm going to be using some White Star here. But we'll start out with that black, so I'm beginning with some Dungeon Stone Grey, and to apply it I've got that same brush, the size 00 once again, because the application is basically the same technique as what we've just been doing on those reds. So just like before, make sure the paint's nicely thinned down and under control. Be careful that your brush isn't overloaded, and then it's time to start looking for the black details and picking out all those edges and corners, such as on the foreleg just here, where we can use the side of the brush to skim down there, but also remember, use the tip of the brush to get the more shallow details, just so you can get those edges too. Now, one other thing to be aware of at this point is there's this little device on the back of his arm right here. The middle of this is grey, so we just want to make sure that we layer this grey at this stage too. Now that we've got that first highlight applied onto the black, we can add our second fine highlight using a light grey. So here I'm using some Calcaridon Grey, and it's looking for all those sharp corners and edges, very much like that fine highlight that we did on the red details. Now going back to that grey bit that we got here, in this case just do an edge highlight all the way around this feature. And finally, it's time to highlight the white features using a pure white. So here I'm using some White Star. This is once again going to be an edge highlight, but focused on these regions. So we're looking at things such as the head and the white parts on the shield. And there we are, the white is now highlighted. So with this stage reached, we've now actually painted the vast majority of Commander Farsight, and now it's just a matter of painting some smaller details. And what we'll do is start out by painting in the smaller things that are like the little gold details that look like screw heads, and for this what we need is a nice bright gold to get started with. I'm going to use some Dragon's Gold here, and once that's done what we can do is base coat the parchment, and here I'm going to go for some Skeleton Legion, so a nice sort of medium bone colour. Once those two base coats are applied, we can then wash them, and here we'll need a dark brown wash. So in this case, I'm going to use some Battle Mud wash. We're going to start out with the base coat of the gold, so I'm using Dragon's Gold here, and to apply it, I'm going to go for my size 0 brush, so a nice size for these sort of details. Just bear in mind, some of these little details can be quite small, so you might want to have a smaller brush on hand. The choice really is yours. But the process is the same throughout, of just making sure your paint's thinned down correctly, and just being careful not to overload your brush. Then it's a matter of looking for these features and blocking them in. Now, as I mentioned, we're looking at for these things that are sort of screwhead-like. So we're looking at ones like this, and all you got to do is just neatly block them in at this stage. But bear in mind, there is also a little bit of gold that appears on the base of his sword. So we're looking at this little part just down here. Be sure to get this little ring at the end there. And also on his bonding knife, there's a little bit of gold to do. And it's a bit hidden away up there, but be sure to get that at this stage as well. Once you've found all of those gold details, it's then time to move on to base coating the parchment, and here we need a medium bone colour. So in this case, I'm using some Skeleton Legion. Now you have one quite long trail just here, but there's also one underneath here. And don't forget to get the really small one that appears on his bonding knife just up there as well. With those base coats applied, we can now put the wash over both of these colours. So you'll need a dark brown wash here, and in this case I'm using some Battlemud wash, and we just want to paint it directly over all the gold and also all of the parchment. The wash is now completely dry on those features, so we're ready to move on to the next step, which is going to be to clean them up to prepare them for highlighting. So what we need to do is some layering here. We'll go back to that gold first of all. In this case, we should return to the original colour that we used. So in our case, that's going to be Dragon's Gold. And once that's done, we can then do the same thing with the parchment. So again, back to the original colour you chose here. In this case, that's going to be Skeleton Legion. But first of all, we need that gold. So we're going back to Dragon's Gold here, and to apply it, I'm using my size 0 brush again. And with this layering stage, we're just looking for the flat surfaces on the gold details. So once your paint's thinned and ready, really it's nice and obvious in these parts because we're mainly looking at these screw head design things here. What we want to do is focus on these raised up flat regions just here. So it's a matter of just applying it onto the flat part here, skipping past those recesses we have in the middle of these parts and carrying on again on the other side. Once that's done, you can see we've got that nice shine back on those golden areas. So now what we need to do is some layering on the parchment. And for this, I'm returning to that original colour. So in this case, it's back to Skeleton Legion, and we're looking to apply this onto the flat parts whilst carefully avoiding the recesses. Now on the main flows of them around here, there aren't many recesses to avoid, just a few prominent ones, such as just in here, which we've got to be careful about that really dark region. But the main thing is to make sure you keep the shading in between the two layers of each part of it. So around here, for example, just being careful not to drop into the corner down there. And with that, the layering is now completed on those colours, so it's time to highlight them. And we'll start out with the gold. In this case, what you want is quite a pale gold, a nice sort of silvery gold. So I'm going to use some glistening gold here, and then once that's done, we can highlight the parchment. And in this case, I'm going to go for 2 colours to really bring them out a little bit. So I'm going to start out with a pale bone colour. I'm going to use some Vampire Fang for this, and then we can go for an off-white. So here I'm going to be using some Ivory Tusk. But first of all, we need to highlight that gold. So I'm using some glistening gold, and I've switched to my small brush here, so my size 00. And what I'm going to do is just look to accentuate the edges that stand out here on the golden details. So if we take a look at this one just at the top here, the first thing to do is look for those ridges down the center, and with the side of the brush, just carefully move in and just skim down them so you get a highlight going down that side and then a little notch on either end. And then just turn the model around and do the same thing on the other side. So we're just looking at approaching like that and going down that angle there as well, so it mirrors the other side. Once that's done, look for the angle where the light would catch towards the top, which is going to be along here, and then just do a bit of a crescent shape with this colour, just going along the top around here. And there we are, that gold's completed, so now we can finish off the parchment too, and for this first we need a highlight of a pale bone colour. So here I'm using some Vampire Fang, and to begin with we just need to skim along the outside edge using the side of the brush on both parts of each one, so just along there like that, but also look for prominent creases that stand out, such as this one right here that I just want to get across there, and also we've got some wrinkles where it goes up to the knot around here, so look for the ridges that stand out again and just go down each one. And then to finish off the parchment, we can move on to a final highlight using an ivory colour. So here I'm using some Ivory Tusk. What we want to do is just do a little edge highlight on the very ends of each part. So just skimming along little regions there like that. And also just using this colour in small ways just to emphasise the knot around here. So all the parts that stand out, again, just add a little touch of this colour to those areas. And with that, the parchment's now finished, so it's time to move on to painting the blade of the iconic Dawn Blade. And for this, what we should do is base coat it first of all entirely with a darker silver. So here I'm going to use some Dwarven Iron, and then there's like a little blue detail that we need to pick out. In this case, what we want is a sort of slightly aquamarine blue. So here I'm going to be using some Cursed Blue. But what we need to do is start out by base coating with that dark metal. So in this case, I'm going to be using Dwarven Iron, and I'm applying it with my size 0 brush here, but just go for whatever brush you're comfortable with for this stage. All we're looking for is a neat and even base coat across the swords. So what we're looking at is this part around here that we just need to block in entirely with this colour, just smoothly applied. Just being careful when you get close to the black around the hilt, and that includes this bit just here. So take your time as you're doing this part especially. With the base coat done, it's then time to move on to a turquoise, and this is for this ridge part at the end just here. So I'm using some Cursed Blue, applied again using the size 0 brush, and just take your time running it into this recessed texture. Now those 2 base coats are applied, the next thing to do is to put a wash on the blade, and we need it to look nice and clean, so in this case we need to use a black wash. So I'm going to return to Oblivion black wash here, and to apply it this time I'm going to go for my size 1 brush, so a sort of medium sized brush here, good size for the sort of area we need to cover. what you should do is just load up and then start painting it directly over the blade and the blue part too. So if we start around here, what we want to do is just apply it onto the flat and start pushing it around, just being careful not to let it build up too much in any one area, because we don't want any like drops or anything like that once it dries. But the key thing to do here is to make sure that you do get this into some of the recessed texture that appears on the blade, because there are some small subtle scratches on there, so applying the wash is just going to help mark them out. So just need to paint it all over like this. Once that wash is dry, you'll have some nice shading on the sword, but it will have dulled things down, so what we need to do is just re-establish that shine now. So for this, we're going to return to Dwarven Iron, but then also we're going to add in a lighter silver towards the cutting edge. So here I'm going to go for some Surcoat Silver. It's a nice sort of medium silver here, but we'll start out with the darker of the two, using some Dwarven Iron, and to apply it, I've gone back to my size 0 brush, and all we need to do now is apply a thin layer of this on a particular part of the sword. So just make sure you've got that paint thinned down and ready, and that your brush isn't overloaded with too much of it, so that we retain a nice smooth finish. And then what we're looking to do is to paint the back of the sword. So we're looking at this region along here. So this flat section going around the back just here, and then following around the front, but not bothering about the actual cutting edge down there, which is going to be the lighter part next. Now whilst you're doing this, you will encounter those scratches which we've got down towards here, and as you encounter them, just leave them a little bit darker and duller. So just carefully work around them so that they stand out just along there like that. With that shine re-established on the back of the sword, we can now add a shine to the front of the sword. So we're looking at the cutting edge that's angled in just here, and in this case I'm using a lighter silver, so it's some Surcoat Silver layered on this part only, so that we're going to get a slight tonal difference between the two areas. Now once again, as you get close to any scratches or little dings in the blade, just be sure to avoid those to keep them a little bit darker and duller. Now that we have those two tones of a shiny metal on the sword, we can move on to highlighting the blade, and what we'll need first is a really bright silver. So here I'm going to use some Mithril Blade, and then once that's done, we should highlight that blue bit that's towards the end of the sword. Here I'm going to use some Ray Gun Glow. But first of all, we need the bright silver. So I'm using Mithril Blade applied with my small brush again. So I'm back to my size 00 for this one. And what we need to do is edge highlight the sword. So just like when we're doing the armor, make sure that paint's nicely thinned down so it's really smooth. Be careful to make sure your brush isn't overloaded, and then we can start looking for all those edges and angles on the sword. So for example, we've got the back of the blade just here, which we can approach with the side of the brush and just skim along to get a nice sharp highlight running all the way down there. But when it gets to the actual angle along here where the two tones meet, in this case using the tip of the brush, we just need to follow it all the way down. So just make sure you're nice and steady, really bracing your hands together, and just gradually make your way down to get a sharp highlight in that ridge just there. In addition, we've got the scratches and things, and when it comes to these, we want to emphasize them a little bit more with this color, so just do a highlight alongside each one. And then finally, it's time to move on to a light turquoise. So here I'm using some Ray Gun Glow. And with this, we just need to pick out the edges of these ridges that appear on the sword. So just around here, using the tip of the brush, just run down each one. With that, the blade's now really starting to come together, but there is a bit more colour that we need to add, and that is in these little notches that we've got right there, because there's sort of a pinkish glow in those. So to do it, what we need to do is start by running a burgundy in there. And here I'm going to use some Sword Hilt Burgundy. Then what we want is a really bright pink, so I'm going to use some Neo Pink here, and this is going to help it pop out a little bit. But first of all, we need that burgundy. So I'm going to use some Sword Hilt Burgundy, and with the really small brush again, so that size 00 once more, I'm just going to get some of this and really run it into quite a bit of water to make it quite inky, so a nice thin version of it there like that. Then all we need to do is load up a small amount of this, again being careful not to overdo it so that we don't lose control of it, and all we need to do is run it into these recesses. So this one, for example, just point the brush straight at it and just introduce that colour into that recessed area. Once that's dry, it's time to move on to a really bright pink. So here I'm using some Neo Pink, and with your fine brush once more, just add a small amount of this into the middle of each of these recesses. So we're looking at in areas such as just in there. And with that, the Dawn Blade is complete. So it's time to move on to painting in all those little glowing blue details. And for this, we should start out with a deeper turquoise. So I'm going to begin with some Sentient Turquoise here. Now to apply it, definitely go for your small brush because these details are all quite small. So you are going to need that control. So a small brush like this is ideal. This is size 00 once more. And then what we need to do is introduce this colour into all the areas where these glows appear. Now, first of all, they appear on these Tau style symbols, such as this one that we've got just here in the chest, and we're looking for the recess in the middle and just underneath the circle at the top. So for this first colour, it's not going to stand out that much, but it is going to set up for the future ones. So we just want that basis just in areas there like that. There's also some of this in the recessed parts and the arms that we can see, such as this one just here. So again, we just want to run this colour into that recess. And there's also this little symbol on his forearm once again. So we're looking for the recesses here too. Just want to drop it into these parts. Finally, there's a bit of this needed on the plasma rifle. You can see these little vents we've got around the ends. Just run it into these as well. We've got that first base coat now applied onto those blue parts, and I did forget to mention, but I've also done lenses too, and you can see there's one just in there, and there's also his eye lens, which is a bit hidden underneath the brim of the white on top of his head right there, but there is one in there, so be sure to get that too. With that done, we can now get a little bit lighter here, so I'm going to move on to some Cursed Blue, followed by a Ray Gun Glow, so going up lighter through turquoise colours here. But we'll start out with Cursed Blue. Again, I'm going to use my small brush to apply this, so the size 00, and as usual, we just need to make sure we've got some of this thinned and ready. Now for the lenses, first of all, what we should do is apply this towards the middle of them, leaving a little bit of the previous blue still visible around the outside. So on this one, for example, that means basically just introducing a circle just there. And then when it comes to the recessed parts, it's a matter of introducing some of this towards the center of each area where the light's going to be stronger. So for example, on this Tau symbol just here, it's going to be just about that part right there, and the lower part of the circle just under here. And once that's done, we can then move on to a lighter turquoise. So here I'm using some Ray Gun Glow, and this just needs to be added towards the middle of each of these features once again. So on the lenses, just close to the center, and on these recessed parts, just in the middle of these regions as well. Now we've reached this colour, we can move on to taking it just that little bit further to finish off these details. And so what we need again is that light turquoise, but now bring some white into it. So I'm using some Ray Gun Glow, and I'm going to mix it with some White Star. And once that's done, I'm just going to go for some White Star on its own. But first of all, we need to do the mix. So it's going to be Ray Gun Glow and White Star. And I've got the two of them next to each other just here on the palette. Once more, I'm using my size 00 brush. And I'm just going to mix them together to get a really bright ice blue. So we're looking for a colour just like that. Then with this, it's a time to once again start bringing this into the middle of these areas. So again, on the lenses, it's going to be a matter of just doing an even smaller dot towards the center. So we're looking at just in there. And when it comes to those recessed designs, well, all we need is a very small amount of this towards the middle now. So for example, this one right here, we just need a small amount just in there. And then finally, we just need a pure white for a few select details, which are going to be these lenses. So here I'm using some White Star, and we just need a fine dot in the middle of each one. So just here, and also the eye lens hidden away under here. And with that, those glowing blue parts are finished, so it's time to give the commander some sept markings. And for these, what you should do is pick the same colour that you used on the white armour, so specifically the mid-tone that you chose to use. In our case, that's Ivory Tusk, and what we're going to do is freehand this onto the armour to create the markings. Now, you can go as complex or as simple as you like here, and you certainly don't have to exactly replicate the box artwork. But if you decide to do this, a great technique to doing it is to start out by just putting some lines on there and then building up from there. So to do this, go for your fine brush. I'm using my size 00 again, and with it, what we need to do is just make sure we've got this thin down, looking for a nice sort of inky feel here. So just bring it down to about this point here, and then just remove the excess off your brush to make sure you've got that fine point. And then with this, we're going to start out by putting some lines on the miniature. So if we take a look at areas such as this shoulder plate just here, what you do is just start out by painting a line going straight down the armour where you want the core of the pattern to be. So for example, just doing a downward motion like this and just gradually building up that line, just bulking it out ever so slightly to about that point there. Now you can just do simple lines like that, or you can play around with it a little bit. So if we do another one right next to it in the same way, what we could do is just bulk it out at the bottom there like that with an angle, and then just add a line down there, and there we go. We're getting more Tau-like symbols, and well, really, this core technique means that you can go as simple or as complex as you like. So once again, down here, what we could do is just do a straight line down the middle, and then we could add a dot next to it. So just put in there like that, and if you wanted to, you could do a short stubby little line right down here. So nice and straightforward. Now, if you're going over large areas, you might want to think about adding a highlight on there. And if you decide you want to, just grab a pure white and just run it where the edge highlight would be that you just painted over. But whether or not you do that, of course, is entirely up to you. And remember, if you do make any mistakes, just switch back to the colour that's underneath it and use that to tidy up. But once you're happy with the markings, Commander Farsight is ready to be based. And as ever, it's entirely your choice how you base your miniature, but in this case, I'm going to go for a grasslands base. And with the base now fully painted, Commander Farsight is complete and ready to lead the Farsight enclaves to war. So when it comes to painting this miniature, there's a really important thing that you need to be aware of, and that's to think about sub-assemblies, in particular on the arms, because remember, they don't actually fit directly into the torso. Instead, they're held by these rings that are a short distance away, meaning there's a gap between the arm and the torso. Now this area can be seen, so if you just undercoat the model and don't paint it, you will see the fact that this part's unpainted. So it's important that you keep the arms separate so you can paint the underside before you stick them on. And if you do this way they'll be in shadow and they'll look the part. Now the other thing goes for when you're painting any sort of Farsight Enclave miniature, and this is choose the right undercoat. I highly recommend you go for a red spray primer, because if you do, the early stages become much quicker and much more satisfying, so it really helps out with that. The last thing is true again on most Tau miniatures, and that is the big hurdle, the big psychological hurdle really when it comes to painting them, and that is highlighting that main red. Now because this consists of almost the entire miniature, this stage will take a long time, but once it's done, if you keep neat and tidy about it, it's going to look great, and once it is finished, everything else from this point on is much quicker. So once you're over that hurdle, you'll find your army comes together faster than you realise. So have fun painting your Farsight Enclave troops, and we'll see you again very soon.